I'm going to start off with a particular technique that I like to use quite a lot to come up with ideas. So here I've got a sound, which maybe you can turn that up a little bit. Cool. So normally I might record this sound in with a MIDI keyboard or a push or a controller or whatever that happens to be, but I'm going to let Live do all the work for me. So what I'm going to do is create a new MIDI track. So Command-Shift-T. And one of the things that you can do in Ableton that's pretty cool is you can route signals around between different tracks, audio signals and MIDI signals as well. So on this MIDI track that I've created, you'll see I've got this option to send the MIDI data from this track to something else. So I can actually send it to any other track, MIDI track in Ableton. So I can send it to this track over here. And now if I arm this track and set this first one to monitor its input, I get the same result, not very exciting, but I'm playing MIDI notes on this second track and it's sending it to the first track. So MIDI's going out of this track into this track, triggering that synth. So what I can start to do is I can create a clip on this track. And inside that clip, I'm just going to put a single note. So that's going to send that note to this synth. So again, not particularly interesting. But what I can do now is I'm going to duplicate this track. So I've got a second track here. And let's just move this note somewhere else. Now remember that this track is also sending to that same track over here. So when I play this, both of these, you can see that both of these MIDI notes, whenever they trigger, they get sent to this track. So again, not particularly interesting. But what I can do with clips in Ableton in the session view is by default the clips are going to be a bar long and they're both just looping in sync. I've got two separate clips. But I can take the second clip and I can adjust the length of its loop. Maybe I'm going to make it a bar and 1 beat long. And what you're going to start to hear happening is these two notes are going to go out of phase with one another and create this sort of changing pattern that you can hear happening in the background. So let's go a bit further. I'll duplicate this again and create a third clip. And let's also set this to a completely different length and move that note around. I'm going to put a utility device or something on here just to crank up this gain a little bit, so you can hear that nicely. Cool. So if you listen to what we've got going now, we've got this kind of semi-generative rhythm happening. So the note's a bit boring, we're going to deal with that in a moment, but the rhythm is constantly changing. So you can hear that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another MIDI track, and I'm going to take the output of all of these 3 MIDI tracks, and I'm going to send them to this new MIDI track that I've created. I'm just going to name this track here my bus, my MIDI bus. And I'll set its input, its monitoring to in, so it's going to monitor those notes, and then tell it to send to this synth here. So same thing. But what I can start to do now is I can process this MIDI data using Ableton's MIDI effects. So Ableton has a bunch of these built-in MIDI effects, which are really powerful tools for coming up with ideas and helping you create sort of beyond what you might be able to play normally. Because these just transform MIDI data, whether you're playing it in with the keyboard or generating it live and manipulating it there. So the first device that I'm particularly interested in is this one called Random. So I'll stick it on this bus. And what Random does is it takes any notes that pass through it. Just yell at me if my giant head's in the way as well. It takes any notes that pass through it and it randomizes their pitch based on this chance control over here. So when it's at 0%, nothing happens, they're not randomized. But when I increase this, every note that goes through there gets a random pitch. So it's kind of interesting. It's a bit atonal, but let's add another MIDI effect to it. I'm going to add this chord MIDI device. So the chord MIDI device, again, processes any MIDI data that passes through it, and you can, of course, chain all these MIDI devices. Just a kind of a little note here in live, what you'll notice is that if I go over to an audio track, like my synth, you'll see how it's got these little audio meters between the devices to let you know that there's audio signal running. But on a MIDI track, we have these little yellow MIDI meters that just tell us that there's MIDI data. So we've just got MIDI data all the way through, all the way to the end of this track. So we can keep processing it with MIDI effects. So on this chord effect, I can add additional notes to create some kind of chord. So I've taken those single notes that are being randomized, created a chord out of them. Still kind of completely atonal, but we're just going to use the last MIDI effect for now, called scale. So scale, I'm sure you've all probably seen this before in Ableton, because it's any non-musician's best friend in Ableton is the scale device. Because the way it works is you've got a bunch of different presets in here for different scale types. So I'm sure you all know when you're writing music, you want to be in a particular scale or a key to kind of have a consistent sound, like a minor or a major. So we can choose from all these different scale types. I'll go with C minor. And any MIDI notes that get passed through here conform to that particular scale. So it's going to sound a little bit more in key. So it sounds a little more pleasant, a little less atonal. Then the cool thing about all of this is that this track that's got our instrument on it, it just sees all of these MIDI inputs as regular MIDI, as if it was coming from a keyboard that I was playing. So what I can do now is I can arm this track and I can hit record, and it's just going to record in all this MIDI data for me. And let that run for a little while. Just capture a bunch of chords. Cool, so let's stop that. And so what I've done here is just using some simple MIDI notes. So these are just all the notes of C3, transform them with these MIDI effects to create some interesting patterns in the key of C minor. And then I've captured all of those patterns. Now, again, this is still quite random, and when we're making music, we usually want to have some kind of repetition or a pattern that we can use. So what we can do with this recording now is we can go in here and just start choosing sections of it. So I can grab a section of this loop, and I need to turn my monitor back to auto so that I can monitor from the clip. And I've got a series of chord progressions. I can choose shorter ones, longer ones. Maybe I'm going to just transpose these down an octave. Let's keep it short for now. And because this is just MIDI data, I can work with this in the same way I would normally work with MIDI. I can transform it further. If I kind of like the notes, but maybe I don't like the positioning of them, I can move the MIDI notes around because it's just MIDI data. So all I've done is I've used Ableton and the MIDI effects in Ableton to generate these ideas and then kind of curate the bits that I like from them. So I've got some chords here. We'll come back to those in a moment. We can do a similar thing for drums as well, drums or percussion. I'm just going to stick these in a group for now so we can hide those away and load up a drum sound. That's going to be quite loud. Cool. So I've got a drum kit. I can take a similar approach to creating drums. I'll go through this quite quickly because it's very much the same concept. Create a MIDI track. Maybe I'll call this one my kick. And on my MIDI 2, send that to the drums. I want to make sure my monitor's on in or that the track is record armed. I'll just leave it like that. And then I can create a clip in here. And let's just program in a pattern. And right off the bat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the length of this loop. So kind of quite a key part of this setup is these polyrhythms, these loops that have different lengths, because that's where you're going to get those interesting timing offsets. And you'll see as well, polyrhythms are going to be a theme that comes up quite a lot, is using timing offsets to kind of generate new things and new ideas, and we'll use that in other areas as well. So I'll send a kick drum. Let's maybe put a hi-hat in here. I've got to set my output. Just kind of draw on a hi-hat pattern and make it a bit shorter. You're going to start to hear I'm going to get a very generative kind of drum pattern happening. So maybe we got the snare. What I find with a lot of these things is, so we're going to record this drum pattern in a while and we can choose a more consistent loop. But what you can do with drums is if you have one element that is consistent, so one element that sort of sticks to your regular 4/4 time to anchor the beat in that time, you can have these kind of polyrhythmic things going over the top but still maintain that feel. So what I can do is I'm just going to leave this one. I'll use a snare drum because it gives us quite a strong anchor, or like this rim. And I'm just going to leave it in 4/4 on the 2 and the 4. So that's going to keep that anchor going. But that kick and that hi-hat over the top are just creating this constantly changing and evolving pattern. And again, in the same way as we did with that synth, if I wanted to, I could just record this in. And get down a pattern that I like, go in here, select different segments. And I've got a more repeating loop. What's quite nice about this as well is when you get to arrangement is because these parts are kind of related to one another, you can often just grab like the second half as a variation. So you'll switch to that maybe for your verse, you have one drum beat for your chorus, same with the chord patterns. So we've got some drums going. So the key there, polyrhythms and feeding MIDI between tracks in Ableton.